Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the incredibly high-stakes story of John Pierpont Morgan. We're looking at a man whose absolute power, boundless wealth, and sheer force of will literally dictated the survival of the United States economy. We're talking about a guy who, with a single word, could save entire industries from total collapse or doom them to bankruptcy.
Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly did one private citizen essentially become the central bank of the United States? It's a massive question, right? J.P. Morgan leaves behind this fiercely debated, completely dual legacy. To some people, he was a deeply patriotic savior who stepped in when the government flat out failed. To others, he was a dangerous, unchecked monopolist who basically held the entire country hostage. We're going to explore the facts, right from our sources, to see exactly how he pulled this whole thing off.
To really grasp his impact, you just need to consider a single staggering number: $3 trillion. After 200 years of acquisitions and consolidations in the banking world, the firm that still bears his name today, J.P. Morgan Chase, is the biggest bank in the world by market cap. They hold an estimated $3 trillion in assets. It's a scale of wealth and influence that is almost hard to wrap your head around, and it all traces back to one man.
Section 1. Early Life and Ruthless Rise. So, where did a titan like this even come from? Let's trace his chronological journey, starting with what were actually some pretty unexpectedly bleak beginnings.
Morgan's early life is this sharp, crazy contrast. He was born in Connecticut in 1837 into a very privileged, wealthy banking family. His dad was a highly successful financier. But, his childhood was incredibly rough. He was a deeply sickly kid. He suffered from brutal coughing fits, migraines, seizures, and rheumatic fever. It actually got so bad that his father sent young John to live entirely by himself in the Azores Islands, just out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for nearly a year, hoping the salty air would magically cure him. So it was a life of intense privilege for sure, but also deep, deep isolation.
By 1857, a 19-year-old Morgan enters Wall Street, and he quickly proves to be this hot-tempered risk-taker. Like, in 1859, he recklessly gambles his father's company money on an entire unbought shipment of Brazilian coffee down in New Orleans. He made a profit, but his conservative bosses absolutely hated the risk. This kind of pushed him to strike out on his own, founding his own company in 1861 at age 24. But 1861 also brought unimaginable tragedy. He married his first love, a frail woman named Amelia Sturgis, and just 4 months after their wedding, she tragically died of tuberculosis. Morgan was utterly inconsolable, and he channeled all of that profound grief into becoming an absolute, relentless workaholic.
And that workaholism quickly turned ruthless during the American Civil War. Morgan paid $300 to a substitute to legally avoid the military draft, and instead of fighting, he engaged in some highly controversial war profiteering. He financed a deal to buy 5,000 obsolete surplus rifles from the government for just $3.50 each. Then, after some minor adjustments, his consortium turned right around and sold those exact same rifles back to the government for $22 apiece. That's a profit margin of over 600%. It was wildly lucrative, but as you can imagine, it certainly didn't win him any popularity contests with the general public.
Section 2. The Art of Morganization. Despite the controversies, his power just kept growing. By 1871, he formed the firm that would become J.P. Morgan & Co., and he sets his sights on the most chaotic but vital industry in America at the time, the railroads.
So the crucial point is how Morgan viewed competition. Most people looked at the fierce price-slashing competition of the railroads and just saw pure chaos. Morgan? He saw opportunity. He invented a tactic so effective it literally got named after him: Morganization. He would buy out struggling competing railroads, forcefully streamline their management, and merge them all into one massive monopoly. By eliminating the competition entirely, they could set whatever prices they wanted and achieve these massive economies of scale.
Through this strategy, J.P. Morgan eventually owned a staggering 1/3 of all railroads in America. Think about that for a second. To put that into perspective, at this time, railroad companies made up 60% of the entire American stock market. He wasn't just investing in the market, he was single-handedly shaping the physical infrastructure of the nation. But you have to understand, Morgan wasn't some passive investor sitting behind a desk. He craved absolute control. If a railroad came to him for funding, he demanded full board control so he could restructure the leadership exactly to his liking. and he used his physical presence to enforce this. Morgan was incredibly self-conscious about a skin condition called rosacea, specifically rhinophyma, which left his nose enlarged, red, and disfigured. But when you combine that with his towering height and his aggressive speaking style, it made him a deeply intimidating figure who simply bullied his rivals into submission.
Naturally, all this unchecked power eventually caused some serious friction. Morgan created this massive holding company called the Northern Securities Corporation, effectively monopolizing railroads in the region. But then, President Theodore Roosevelt takes office and immediately orders an antitrust lawsuit to break the whole thing up. The tension between these two men was incredibly bitter. When Morgan heard that Roosevelt was going on an African safari, he famously quipped, "Good, I hope the first lion meets him does his duty."
But losing one monopoly definitely didn't stop him. Morgan pivoted and bought Carnegie Steel for an astonishing $480 million. He merged it with competitors to create U.S. Steel, which became the world's very first billion-dollar corporation. It had a market cap of $1.4 billion. To understand how insane that is, the entire U.S. manufacturing sector combined at that time was only capitalized at $9 billion. Morgan now controlled roughly two-thirds of American steel production, right on top of his railroads.
Section 3, Saving the U.S. Economy. All right, let's pick up the pace here, because with all of this centralized wealth, Morgan was about to be called upon to perform what essentially amount to high-stakes financial heists. Not to steal money, but to save the entire nation from ruin.
In 1893, America gets slammed by a brutal economic depression. Stocks plummeted, banks collapsed, and terrified foreign investors started cashing in their American bonds for physical gold. The U.S. government's gold reserves were dangerously depleted, scraped down to just $9 million. The United States government was on the absolute brink of defaulting on its loans. It was a complete disaster.
Because there was no central bank back then, the government was completely helpless. So, Morgan takes drastic action. He travels down to Washington to meet President Grover Cleveland. Morgan's audacious scheme was to form a private banking syndicate to purchase $65 million in 30-year gold bonds to shore up the reserves. Once Cleveland finally agreed, Morgan wired his men up in New York, and get this, they sold out all the bonds in just 22 minutes. The market's faith was instantly restored. America was saved from total collapse. Though, we have to note, Morgan secured very generous rates on those bonds, meaning he personally profited immensely while saving the country.
Fast forward to the panic of 1907. Once again, banks are on the verge of bankruptcy, and people are literally queuing around the block just to withdraw their cash. The situation was so dire that President Teddy Roosevelt, yes, the exact same man who broke up Morgan's railroad monopoly, was forced to swallow his pride and beg his arch-rival J.P. Morgan to intervene.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer force of Morgan's personality. He was 70 years old at the time, suffering from a terrible cold. He summons all the leading financiers to his private Madison Avenue library. He proposes a plan where they would all pool their money to fund their smaller, failing competitors to stop the panic. When they hesitated, Morgan quite literally locked the library doors. He refused to let anyone leave overnight until they agreed to his bailout plan. By morning, they caved. With Roosevelt's approval, the U.S. Treasury added $25 million to the pot, and the crisis was averted.
Section 4, A Complicated Legacy. So Morgan had saved the economy twice, but this immense concentration of power absolutely terrified the American public. As we enter the final chapter of his life, the public backlash against him reaches a boiling point.
The age of the unchecked robber baron was coming to an end. People realized, hey, it is incredibly dangerous for a nation to be completely dependent on the whims of one single private banker. Morgan was subpoenaed to testify before the Pujo Committee, a congressional hearing investigating Wall Street's so-called money trust. An aging, deteriorating Morgan sat front and center, essentially becoming the literal face of terrifying monopoly power. The findings of this committee directly paved the way for the government to step in and take control back.
Morgan's end came pretty quickly after that. In 1912, amidst all the stress of those Pujo hearings, he actually narrowly escaped death by pulling out of his scheduled voyage on the Titanic at the very last moment due to health issues. Crazy, right? But his health continued to decline anyway. In March of 1913, J.P. Morgan died while on vacation in Rome at the age of 75. And just months later, in late 1913, the United States government officially created the Federal Reserve, a central banking system explicitly designed so that the country would never, ever again have to rely on a man like J.P. Morgan.
Which brings us to a final question I really want you to think about. Based on everything we've explored in this explainer today, was J.P. Morgan a patriotic savior who stepped up and rescued America when its own government was totally powerless? Or was he a dangerous, greedy monopolist who held the nation's economy hostage for his own personal gain. The facts point strongly in both directions, leaving us with what is undeniably one of the most fascinating and consequential legacies in modern history.